Good afternoon, Milwaukee. This is the Mark Belling Late Afternoon Show on News Talk 1130 WISN. I'm going to prove a point real briefly. When is the Brewers' next game? How many people could answer that question? In fact, their home opener is today. It was supposed to be Friday. Well, it was supposed to be like months ago. Then it was supposed to be Friday. Then it was supposed to be Saturday. Then they're supposed to have an opener. There's a doubleheader on Sunday. Their home opener is tonight. You can't go, but their home opener is tonight unless, like, somebody tests positive and then there is no home. Who knows? How many people could have answered that question? When was the Brewers' next game? Less than half, yeah. We're going to do something that I don't want to do because I resist doing it, but Paul balls me out. I like to delay giving out this Sizzling Summer Cash Contest as long as I can, because I know some of you tune in right at the top of the hour to hear this word and then go off and, what do they go off and listen to? No, well, then I may as well do it right now. I don't know. I don't agree with that. I think some tune in to hear the word and then they turn the radio off. You think nobody does that? So, well, that's who I'm out there to stymie. That's my goal. The difference between the masses and all is the difference between being first and ninth in the ratings, which you ought to understand. Do it my way. I'm going against. We're going to end up waiting just by me crabbing about having to do it. Paul doesn't like it that I wait forever to do the word, and sometimes when I wait forever, I then forget, which is why it's his responsibility to tell me to do it. But then I yell at him for nagging me to do it. So we'll give you the Sizzling Summer Cash Contest. By the way, we had another winner on my program. We're up to 3 on my program in this latest round of national contesting. You know, these things, we have one, and then there's a few weeks where there isn't one. They come back on again. We haven't had as many winners for NWISN as we have had in some of the others. The one right before that popped out right after the lockdowns and coronavirus, we had a ton of them. 3 so far on my show, and I think we're up to 9 on WISN, and that was on the last program that I did, which is on Thursday. So maybe we can get another winner, at least one more winner this afternoon. Again, I give one of these at the, right after the top, or somewhere after the top of each of the 4 hours of the show, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The first word is love, L-O-V-E, love. Text in love to 200-200 anytime between now and 4 o'clock. Love. Easy word to remember. You'll get a text confirming entry plus iHeartRadio info, standard data, and message rates apply in this nationwide contest. See, I have a method here as to whether or not I've done the word and to remember not to do it twice, which we're not allowed to do. I throw it away after I do it the first time. So if it's gone, Paul asked me like last week, did you do the word? I said, it's in the garbage. I must have done it because I only throw it in the garbage after I do it. Yeah, see the kind of tricks that like stroke patients do to keep from going like addled. I need more of those things. A brief comment, a brief little story, and then move into something in greater depth. A lot of things are going on out there, including whether or not Evers is going to issue an order to shut down all of the schools in the state of Wisconsin. The first week out of the mask mandate, what's going on with, is Joe Biden actually, we laughed about it, is Joe Biden going to choose an actual communist as his running mate? I think what's happening right now is he's trial ballooning. He'll throw out and they'll leak, this is the one it looks like it's going to be, to see what the reaction is, and then they pull it back and they try it with somebody else. I just have a hard time thinking that Bass is the one. I always know what Democrats are up to. But this woman is an actual Marxist. I mean, she was a traitor in communist Cuba, for heaven's sakes. I just think that if Biden wants to win, they're going to choose somebody that they can go as far to the left as they can without going so far to the left that it horrifies people into not voting for him. Anyway, Vicki made a brief comment at the end of her program that I want to take in a little bit of a different direction. She was talking about how she was out all weekend and she didn't see anybody that was going nuts over the people that weren't following the mask rules. And she said it doesn't matter what people say in the public opinion polls. Now, if you've been following the public opinion polls on this, there's overwhelming support for mask requirements. Overwhelming. I mean, like, more overwhelming than 1 + 1 = 2. And a lot of politicians are reacting to this, and a lot of people think that if the Republicans in the state legislature try to block the Evers rule, and there's difference of opinion about whether they should, that they're going to be on the wrong side of public opinion on this issue, that the public overwhelmingly wants to have a mask requirement. And that's, again, based on these polls that are out there, and they've been rather consistent. They show virtually unanimous support among Democrats, but still majority support among Republicans for these mask requirements. However, this is the different direction I'm taking it in. And this is going to be a brief segment, and I want to share a news story that's related to it in a moment and then go off into something larger. I believe a few people have hinted at this, and I'm going to take it a little bit farther. I believe that the era of public opinion polls in the United States is over. I believe that they are no longer a barometer that you can use. And I would not be surprised if in the fall election, a lot of them are wrong on a lot of races, not just the presidential. I think we are at a point, until very recently, most people, when they talk to a pollster, were honest. Few people have been, screwed up and lie, but most people were honest. And public opinion polling, and I don't just mean on political races, but attitudes in society and so on, has been very effective and I think generally accurate. And the people that are involved in working in it, they know what they're doing. There are controversial elements to it, such as constructing the sample size, which groups you overweight, etc. But they have generally been very, very good at it. And it's been something that has been taken over and used in almost every business that exists, to the point that some industries are incapable of moving without surveying, focus groups, and so on. Our own company does it all the time. Politicians, they poll daily. It drives and guides the way that they react to news. It's a big, big thing, and I believe that we are on the cusp of this being over. I don't believe public opinion polls are reliable anymore. Why? We're in the era of virtue signaling. You have all sorts of people who are going to say what they think makes them look good, or they say what will make them feel good, without regard to what they actually think or what they actually do. We're in an era in which people realize that if they say or certain things or hold certain opinions, that their life can literally be ruined. This is going to affect how people respond to surveys. If you think that we're in such a witch hunt standard that if you say the wrong thing or express the wrong opinion, that it can ruin your life, are you going to be honest with the pollster? I think some are not. In addition to that, you also have people who simply give answers to questions that make them feel good. Now, a couple of examples to make this point. I'm trying not to let this go on too long. Stop me from letting this go on too long. Why don't you do your job in there? Take care of this. Stop me from going too long. Well, I haven't gotten to the point yet. I can't stop now. I haven't even done the thing yet. As I mentioned, there's overwhelming support for mask requirements and even higher numbers of people who say that they wear masks when they go out in public. Yet, anybody who's been out in public, especially when you get away from, say, the city of Pewaukee, is aware that the number of people wearing masks is way lower than what the polls numbers would say. People lying. It makes them feel good. Do you believe that you should wear masks at all public places? Yes. There, you know, you got people walking right down the street or walking in a building or walking into such and such in a place where the mask is either not required or it is required and they're just not going to do it. Yet what do you think they told the public opinion pollster? They told him yes. It makes them look good and it makes them feel good. Another example. It's from the opposite side. I won't give the guy's name. I never give anybody's name. Why do I even say anymore? I won't give the guy's name. I was watching the Bucks game on Friday night. Not the one last night where they fell apart at the end of the game. For those of you who didn't know, they fell apart at the end of the game last night. I was watching the Bucks game on Friday night, and it was an exciting ending and had an extremely controversial ending when, as you know, I can't stand replay, but if ever there was a case for replay, it was the way the Bucks won on Friday night. There was an absolutely terrible call, and the replay showed that it was a terrible call. They reversed it, and it literally decided the game. Giannis would have fouled out. The Bucks would have lost the 2-point play, and the foul would have been called on Giannis, and the basket that Giannis scored would have been taken away, and he would not have gone to the free throw line. And they reversed the call, and they determined that the foul was on the defensive player. So Giannis' 2-point play counts, so they get the 2 points on. He goes to the free throw line and made the free throw, so that's 3 points that they got, and the foul was taken away, so he didn't foul out of the game. The Bucks went on to win. It was the right call. It was clearly the right call. Boston's whining about it, but nonetheless, it added, I bring up all of this, it added kind of a fascination at the end of the game. And I was talking to a guy, and he said, you know, if somebody asked me, are you going to watch the NBA tonight? Or did you watch the Bucks game tonight? I would have lied and said no because I'm so hacked off at him. You know, and the NBA players, all of the stuff all over the uniforms and the broadcasters talking the social justice. But the guy admitted, there he was. He watched the end of the game. He thought it was a fantastic end of the game. He said, I wouldn't admit it. If a pollster asked me, I'm going to try to make it look like I'm one of the people that have turned away. So here's where I'm going with this. I think we are now at a point in which people may tell pollsters questions that don't actually reflect what they do, but they're actually trying to send a statement that isn't even what they're living up to in their life. If that's the case, that means that public opinion surveys are no longer reliable. Give you a quick example. Let's imagine a company said, would you be likelier to buy our product if we were more adamant in our support for racial justice? My guess is, overwhelmingly, the responses would be yes. Who's going to say no? So the company might do it. But a lot of those people who said yes might be people who don't like all of this political messaging on the product, but they weren't going to tell the pollster this. In other words, I think that there's a real disconnect here on these things. Now, I've said forever, here's the part of this that isn't new. Never mind what people say, watch what they do. I've been saying this forever, yet we've known that people get into far more trouble for what they've said than what they do. You find something that somebody said, Josh Hader's tweets from 7 years ago, doesn't matter what he's done in his life and so on. He can get away probably with all sorts of terrible behavior, but he said this, it's what he said. He said. Never mind what people say. Talk is worthless. I know this. I make a career out of talking. Anybody could say what I say. Anybody could make it up. You wouldn't be any good at it, but anybody could say whatever it is that they feel like saying. Watch what people do. It brings me to the final component of the story, which I've tried to make short. An interesting thing happened over the weekend. We're still figuring out exactly what it was. This is fascinating stuff. The story was botched and missed by the media. In part, one of the things that's going on with the media right now is they got all these TV reporters working remotely and everything. There's no communication. Things that like everybody knows about, the media doesn't know about. They had this thing called the Sandbar Bash in Oshkosh over the weekend. Do you know about this? Oh, you always see, you're another example of somebody who says something that you can't go by what you say. Paul says he sort of heard of it. I don't know what do you mean you sort of heard of it? You know the name, so you don't know what it is or when it happened. You don't know. Oh, you know it's nothing. Okay. The Evers mask order took effect on Saturday. Well, they had this thing that they apparently hold every year on Lake Butamore in Oshkosh. Butamore is the lake that, it's a complicated lake to explain because people drive over the top of Lake Butamore and they think that they're driving over Lake Winnebago. You can't drive over Lake Winnebago. Then it'd be like the longest bridge in the state of Wisconsin. Lake Butamore is the lake that it runs way west, but it runs through Oshkosh and to the west of Oshkosh, and it's near where the Fox River is. If you drive north on Interstate 41 and you go over that bridge when you're in Oshkosh, that's Lake Butamore. And then if you keep going north, you drive over, I make fun of this forever. You keep driving north and you head in toward Appleton off of Interstate 41. You know what lake you drive over? Little Lake Butamore. I swear, I come from the most backward area of planet Earth. How in the world can you, first of all, Butamore, and then ask somebody how to spell Butamore. Unless you're from up there, no one would get it right. You would think Butamore would be spelled Budamore, right? It looks like Buddy Desmorts. That's what we would call it, Buddy Desmorts. It's Butte, new word, DES, new word, MORTS. Evidently it's French. Blame them for this again. I don't know. Is it? No, I don't believe there is. I don't know, but when I grew up there, people would make fun of it anyway. So they've got the two. No wonder these things take so long. But how can I not talk about this story? You have Lake Butamore, and what's the next lake up? Little Lake Butamore. For crying out loud! You couldn't come up with a more creative name than that. Well, this is where I'm from. You wonder why I turned out the way that I did. These things were all named long before me. These are the ancestors that settled the Fox Valley. Yes, there is Little Chute. And what do you think is west of Appleton? Grand Chute. Here's the weird thing. For the longest time, Little Chute was bigger than Grand Chute. Grand Chute's suburban, so it grew, so it got to be big. Yeah, there's Little Chute, and on the east of Appleton is Little Chute, and west of Appleton is Grand Chute. We've got all these locks on the Fox River, that they put the locks in so that the rivers would be navigable and so on. So all the way between Green Bay and Lake Winnebago, which is the extent. We're not talking about now the Fox River that runs through Waukesha here, the other Fox River, the one in the Fox River Valley. And they have all these locks in here. And there's this community in the Fox Valley. It's right next to my city, Kaukauna. There's Kaukauna, Kimberly, Little Chute. We're all in there. And they have the area where the lake... the river, the Fox River just literally takes this goofy little dip. So they got these two locks that they have to combine. Do you know what the name of the community is? Combined Locks! I tell these stories. You think that I'm making them up. I'll grant you, we were ahead of our time and not wanting to offend anybody. Although there are a lot of Indian names that are, when's that going to happen? Where the Indian names are now off all the cities. That it's bad enough for the nicknames that all the cities with the Indian nicknames, it's just like half of Wisconsin. When is that going to happen? When are they going to start in on that? Well, they say you can't, you can't do that? They're ripping down statues like crazy. Biden's about to name an actual communist as his running mate. That we may elect as president of the United States a man who is out and out senile. What do you mean they can't do that? You can't say they can't do that on anything. They can't do that. Well, yeah, there will be year and a half. No, so at least I don't know how they can possibly claim Combined Locks is an offensive name. It's offensive only in that, my goodness gracious, what a goofy name for a Combined Locks. Well, you know why. I will say this. A lot of these things, somebody asked me, well, how'd Milwaukee get its name? And if that's debated even to this day. It's not hard to figure out how Combined Locks got its name. This is why I said I'd make this short. This is your fault. You were going to stop it, remember? Yeah, and you were going to take control and tell me to stop. Well, then stop. Well, where were you 10 minutes ago when this is needed before I went into Combined Locks? And anyway, on Lake Butamore, which is right on the banks of the city of Oshkosh, they had this thing that they hold every year. It's called the Sandbar Bash, and people show up on the shoreline and listen to music, and a lot of people park their boats in the little harbor area that they have. And they hold the thing, and it was scheduled to go on this weekend. while we've had social, just about everything that has been held has been canceled. And I've explained forever, anybody that actually plugs on and puts their thing on is going to be wildly successful because nobody has anything else to do. So they plugged on and they said, screw it, we're not going to cancel it. This thing was packed. It's absolutely packed. And the organizers posted photos and videos of it on social media. As you might guess, now that people have seen this, they are horrified. This is the same horror that occurred right after a lot of the lockdowns ended and they reopened things down at the Lake of the Ozarks. Was it Memorial Weekend? I think it's Memorial Day weekend, where they showed those pictures of people down on the beaches on the Lake of the Ozarks, and there were like 97 zillion people there, no social distancing, no nothing. And everybody was horrified and so on. Well, the same thing has now happened in Oshkosh, where, I mean, it's hard to tell what the crowd is other than it was wall-to-wall people. And, of course, none of the guys have their shirts on. Women are wearing swimming suits. And they're just packed on top of one another and not a mask inside. Now, for people who are quarreling about the violation of the Evers order, which nobody can even figure out, the outdoor part wouldn't say that you would have to wear masks, but there's no social distancing. There's literally nothing. It looked exactly like what summers used to be. It looked exactly like the crowd that would be gathered around one of the stages at Summerfest. It looked like any kind of beach concert that was going on. It looked like what the norm was until this year, where you can't do anything like this. Since this has happened, some of the officials at Oshkosh are saying that they have to review whether they're going to allow the thing to happen again. There's a backstory behind this that the Oshkosh Northwestern mentions. The guy who puts it on is a retired sheriff's deputy who doesn't like the current sheriff. The current sheriff in Winnebago County said that they weren't, like many sheriffs, Waukesha's as well, said that they're not going to do anything to enforce the mask order. The Winnebago County sheriff made that comment before the event occurred. Now, again, I don't know that the mask order would have applied in this because it was basically an outdoor event, but they're bringing it in here, and there is this, the guy who put on the event is a former sheriff's deputy who ran for sheriff against the current sheriff. I don't think that has anything to do with this. People are bringing up that little bit of an odd connection to the whole thing. So the argument was, did the carte blanche that they gave them in Oshkosh empower people to go and violate all of this stuff? I would think no, because technically this didn't violate Evers' order, although there was certainly no social distancing or none of the other protocols that you would say people should have in place. And certainly nobody I didn't see anybody in the pictures that I saw voluntarily putting a mask on, which is, again, I'm willing to bet if you asked everybody at that thing, should you wear a mask when you're in a public place? I bet lots of them would have said yes. And there they are out in person, not wearing the mask and doing all of the things that they would normally do. So finally ending this thing that I said would be short. You can't go off what people are saying on these things anymore. Actual opinions that people hold, they're not willing to say. They're not going to say things that will get them in trouble, or even in the reverse, they may say things like, if the NFL players don't stand for the anthem, will you watch the games this year? A lot of people are going to watch the games, and they're going to say, no, I won't. And I said, I know a guy who watched the Bucs game on Friday night, but he said, I would have told people that I'm not. And that is where this area where I think you just can't go off of public opinion surveys on anything anymore. And I would caution politicians and many others to try to now go back to the old way and be a little bit more intuitive. From the beginning, in my time in radio, I have recoiled against this focus group thing. I mean, this is not anything new. They were even doing that TV show Mad Men from the 60s. They even had a focus group in that. Remember what the focus group was for? Weren't they putting makeup on? Lipstick, was it? They're putting on lipstick, and a focus group is when you have people that they're behind a two-way mirror, and supposedly they don't know that they're behind a two-way mirror, and you ask them questions about a product, or in this case, they gave them a product to see how to use, and they're watching. Anyway, well, this goes back even before I was in Milwaukee, where you do these focus groups, and you get like 10 people in, and you ask them, what do you think about this, and what do you think about this, and what do you think about that personality? I won't name the city I was in because I don't want to torment the general manager, but like one or two people would say something, and you know what? They acted like that. One guy says something and say they don't like the way. Oh my goodness gracious. One guy said he didn't like something. So therefore we can't do that ever again because we put such incredible weight into all of this. I have always felt, and I'm not saying that a business should not do what their customers want. That's not what I'm saying. And you shouldn't try to ascertain it. I'm saying that if somebody is in a business and they don't know what their customers want, they're in the wrong business. If I needed a focus group to tell me how to do a good talk show, I shouldn't be doing a talk show. If I need a consultant to tell me how to do a talk show, I would think the consultant should take my job because they'd be better at it than me. The people who create products and the people who do things and really create really anything are those that generally come up with something that nobody ever knew that they wanted. Steve Jobs is the obvious example of that. And the products that he created, that he envisioned, no focus group ever said, gee, I want to have I don't want to play my music on a CD player anymore. I want to have this little thing that you spin a wheel around and it's all the music all somehow in this little tiny little thing in here. And I don't ever want to have an album. Nobody ever would have said that. They all would have said just I want to see, etc. All the stuff that a phone does. Oh no, I wouldn't need that. I wouldn't need that. I just think of the number of people who told me 15 years ago, I'll never text. They're all the ones that now won't stop texting. So what people think they want is not necessarily what they want. If you're really, really good at something, you figure out what people want before even they have. When you're simply reacting to what everybody tells you, you're just putting yourself in the average. You're never going to be anywhere ahead. So tying all of that up, and it is going to relate a little bit to the first segment that I get into in here. What people say is not necessarily what they think or what they will do anymore. Now to this. I received an interesting communication from a listener. And I think it speaks volumes about how political correctness is stifling our world. In this case, I have to name the business because you can't do the story without naming the business, but the business owner contacted me, so they're fine with it. Mark, I've been listening to you for years, and thank you so much for all the great information and perspective that you provide. I moved to North Carolina for 7 years and couldn't find any local conservative talk show hosts that were any good, so I've been listening to your podcast to keep me informed. The thing that I really like, and I don't need to go through all this, but I'll say it quick. The thing that I really like about your show is that you actually take time to teach about a topic or explain the whole story, and I really learned a lot by listening to you. We just moved back to Greendale from North Carolina. Anyway, I just wanted to share what happened to us yesterday. I know it's nothing in comparison to people getting beaten up and losing careers or even lives over this ridiculous new definition of political correctness, but it is a big deal to us. My husband and I grew up in Greendale and graduated from Greendale High School. Both of our families still live here, and even though we have lived in North Carolina the past 7 years, we maintained a residence in Greendale, spent the summers here, and visited as often as we could. Last January 20 of 2019, we started a small side business called Green Roots Matter. We design and sell Greendale-inspired apparel and other cool material. For those of you, and I always forget to do this, for those of you who may not be aware of where Greendale is a suburban community within Pewaukee County, and actually, some people confuse it with Greenfield. Greenfield is a little bit bigger than Greendale. Greendale actually has some fairly interesting history behind it. You could actually probably write a spectacular book about Greendale and what it developed over the years. Anyway, there is a unique story about Greendale, and the people there have a little bit more pride, I would say, than the average community for a number of reasons. So anyway, they came up with this idea of starting this thing, Green Roots Matter. Now, roots refers to the roots of the community. We design and sell Greendale-inspired apparel and other cool matter. Matter here is intended as a noun with a nod to the fact of our Greendale heritage is important to us. In other words, what they're saying here is matter. The matter they're referring to is we're selling matter. Like we're selling stuff. Our entire goal was to celebrate the fun, quirky side of Greendale, and we committed to donating a portion of our profits back to Greendale organizations and improvement projects. We started out selling T-shirts at the downtown market last summer, and it was very popular. People loved our designs and references to some of the inside jokes that only those who live in Greendale will get. The Greendale Welcome Center began selling our products, and we are now selling in a few other shops in downtown Greendale as well. With all of that, we still ended up losing thousands of dollars on the venture, which is okay with us, feeling that our main goal was to get some fun stuff onto out into Greendale and promote Greendale pride. Despite the financial loss, we made good on our promise to give back to local organizations and made multiple donations. This summer, we are selling at the market and local shops again. If you figured out where the story is going to go, I wonder how many people have figured out where the story is going to go. What's he doing bringing something into me and you're hauling in the weather? I wonder how many people in the audience have figured out exactly where this story is going. Do you know where it's going? You're on the right track. You're on the right track, but you're nowhere near where the story actually ends up. And the reason I'm sharing this, he's on the right track, like he's gotten on the road, but he's 100 miles away. But you're on the right highway. I mean, you're not like going the wrong way or anything. You know, it's not like you're going south when you're supposed to be going north. Anyway, picking up after that little aside. This summer, we're selling at the market and local shops again. But what has changed is the fact that now the word matter, this is what Paul said, in any form seems to be off limits. Someone from Greendale posted a picture of her sons wearing our new hat design and tagged our business, Green Roots Matter, in the post. The post was meant to be positive, a way to promote the new hat and encourage people to attend the market this Saturday morning. I'm sure you can imagine what happened next. Paul, can you imagine what happened next? Paul said they got attacked after it went viral. Yeah, now we're getting there. Someone questioned the name of our business by asking, is Green Roots Matter a play off Black Lives Matter? And as I've learned, a question is usually a statement in disguise. And that's when the shirt storm started. Get it? Shirt storm. If you don't get it, I'm not explaining it. I didn't mean to you. I have included screenshots of the posts here, and she sent me pages of Facebook posts that are as bad as you can imagine. So many people defended us. Probably 90% of the comments were in support. And I know from my own personal experience that most people are afraid to say anything in opposition to this way of thinking, for fear of retaliation. So her point was she's amazed she got as much support as she did, because right now people are terrified to be on the wrong side of this issue. But the few people who feel they have the right not to be offended in any way won again. We caved. And I hate that we did. It goes against every fiber of my being to cave to such, and then she has a word. But in the end, this whole thing was supposed to be fun. My husband has a real job. He'd really like to keep it. I don't think it's a stretch to imagine that someone could decide to take this to the next level. So now we are just plain old, boring Green Roots. In the end, I know it doesn't matter what we are called, but I hate that they won again. She signs it. This is the level at which this oppressive political correctness has gotten to. Green Roots Matter, which is probably a play on words, but remember, they started this thing a year and a half ago, prior, when Black Lives Matter was nowhere near the kind of thing that it is now. Maybe it was a play on the words or not, but obviously the title in and of itself had a meaning. Green, referring to Greendale, roots, referring to the roots of the community, and matter. Well, matter is stuff that you sell, like matter is as in this matter and that matter and so on. And that was the name that they came up with, and it was a kind of a clever sounding name, and you're supposed to have a clever sounding name if you're going to be a business, and it was mostly a small little business, and they're selling this little stuff to deal with Greendale. The instant that it makes social media, which is the only way you can get the word out about anything, somebody now draws the conclusion that you're trying to make why are you using the word matter in here? Oh my goodness, you can't say this. You could only say Black Lives Matter. Just as many people were horrified about the number of people who have lost their careers and their lives for saying all lives matter, which has been deemed by those in charge of policing such things to be a racist statement, you now apparently can't use the word matter in any type of context without somebody being offended. Now, the lady points out that she just hates the fact that they came, but she said, look, it's just a little side business. My husband has a career and so on. I don't want people to take this to the next level of going out and destroying our lives, so we just dumped this. When Paul said a little bit earlier, well, they won't ever make you take the Indian names off of the cities. One can't imagine how far this is going to go unless the American public figures out how to stop it. And right now, the American public has not figured out how to stop it. It doesn't matter that it is not a majority opinion. We have not figured out how to stop it. I do believe that people are conflicted. Some of them are of the opinion that if you give the pressure groups what they want, they'll leave you alone. In other words, let's just throw Trump out, then they'll leave us alone. Others understand, as I try to explain to you, once you start caving, there's no end to the caving, and they will never stop. They will see you as a soft mark and push for more and more and more and more and more. A number of leading figures in Chicago today called for the Chicago public schools to ban the teaching of history. You're thinking I'm making these things up. They want to ban history courses in the schools, saying that history has led to racism in the United States. They simply don't want to teach it. They don't want to teach anything in history because, frankly, if you teach any history of the United States, even if they make it politically correct, it's mostly teaching about the successes of our country and so on. They don't want any teaching of history because they don't want any teaching about the United States. There are members of the Illinois State Legislature that are part of the group calling for a ban on the teaching of history in Chicago. When you start erasing your history, and I would guess that that's what the stopping of the teaching of history is, just as the taking the names and monuments down and so on, this is something that has been done in every major totalitarian society that you can think of. The two biggest totalitarian regimes in our world in the last century are China and Russia. And whenever they have a power change in China or Russia, the statues and the names come down. After Mao left and Deng Xiaoping came in, everything that Mao believed in was gone. And the references to Mao were gone. And supporters of Mao were gone. And then Deng Xiaoping was gone, and suddenly Mao was back in. Hard to keep track if Mao was in or Mao was out, but he went back and forth. The same thing in Russia. At one point, Stalin and Lenin were in. Then after World War II and after Stalin left and Khrushchev came in, suddenly Stalin was repudiated. Then Khrushchev leaves and Brezhnev comes in, and suddenly Stalin's back in vogue again. You can't even keep track of the names of some of these cities in Russia. For a while, they were Stalingrad and Leningrad. Then they take their names off of them and restore them to their old names on the basis of whether or not they are in or out. And when they are taken in or they are taken out, it affects how the Russian people, and in the case of the Chinese people, were literally taught their own history. In countries in which indoctrination go on, when they take these names off, they literally would then change the history and lie about what actually happened. These things are only done in the kinds of regimes that believe in having thought control. Thought control is now a major tactic of the American left. They want to purge our history, and they want to tell people you're not even allowed to think certain things. They want to go so far as to say that a seemingly benign statement like all lives matter suddenly becomes an act of racism, even though, listening to the words, it would seem crazy to make that conclusion. When we come back after the break, some thoughts and a very interesting piece that I want to share with the audience about what's happening in this country, how bad it is, and how the American public has not figured out a way to respond to this. First, 346 News Talk 1130 WISN.
It's time for Rapid Traffic.
Some emergency railroad crossing repairs going on Brown Deer Road, just west of Green Bay Road. So in both directions of Brown Deer, you will find a lane closed and some slowing around that work. From the Lynch-McGuanago Total Traffic Center.
Thought you quit.
Not yet.
Oh, when do you quit?
Friday's my last day.
But then I got some memo saying that it isn't really that, like, you're going to, you can't possibly going to take vacation before your last day. That's a really Weasley thing for someone.
That's why I was off Thursday.
That was last week that he did it?
I was off Thursday and Friday.
Oh, how would I even know? I'm the one to talk about never being here myself anymore.
You did the show Thursday, didn't you?
Yeah, no, I didn't know. You're right. I didn't know if that was the day that he was. So I just figured this is just one more day that he was off. So no, you're going to work all the way through Friday then?
I'll be here all week, yes.
Oh. Unless you change your mind or something.
Sure you don't
have any sick days that you're going to call in on?
I tried to weasel all that in, but they were.
Oh, you probably were working. You probably knew that this is coming and wormed them all in and over the last few months.
I wish I had.
Yeah, Paul takes notes on those kinds of things.
It would have been a lot smarter.
This comes from the guy who works 4 days a week. All right, now 2-year-old cue here. For those of you not aware, John Wyatt is quitting. He's going to go to work. What radio station is he going to, Paul? He's going to go to one of those sports stations. They're doing real well.
Yeah, I hear they're hiring all the time.
Yeah, they're doing real well. There is no sports, and so is there going to be a World Series this year or not? Everybody predict. Paul said no. John?
No.
John says no. I'll say I always have been taught my entire life to follow the money, and I will say yes, but we also are in this thing with this virus that, as bad as I thought people were going to overreact to this in the beginning, I find it breathtaking.
Yeah.
I just find it breathtaking that because 10 guys on a team get sick with this, that we can't have the guys who aren't sick play baseball.
That's what I don't understand.
It's so bizarre to me. It's like when you heard that a bar where somebody had it and they sent it home. Well, they closed the bar for 2 weeks. Well, just test everybody else, wait for the test, and then if the person who had it was working when they were sick and now they're gone, you're closing. You can't retroactively close. The damage was literally done.
If the staff was there and they're no longer there, then what's the problem?
If the fire department comes and puts out the fire, you're not going to get burned if you go over to after it's put out. And things that are happening are just not making any sense to me. So I will still go with my answer of the financial decision would make obvious sense that they're going to one way or another complete the season if they have to have kids in the Little League playing in the thing. But I will grant you when I saw, Philadelphia's 3 guys sick and they can't play it. Is there any company that doesn't have 3 people testing positive somewhere? We're testing everybody every other day. 3% are always going to test positive. I just assumed that the reason that they have a 30-man taxi squad was that they were going to use those players as fill-ins when guys went down with the virus. Otherwise, what did they have the 30? So I don't know. So I'm going to say yes, but I admit I could very well be wrong. Did you do your OQ or not here?
I did.
Okay, it's 3:50. Mark Belling, late afternoon show. Coolest weather that we've had in weeks. Temperatures are going to drop well into the 50s tonight. Those isolated showers we've had off and on today are going to be ending with a low down to 55. Tomorrow, very cool day, partly sunny. Temperatures like today are going to stay in the 60s, about 68 for a high. A little bit warmer on Wednesday, partly sunny, 73 for a high. Thursday, partly sunny, 75. Friday, partly sunny, 76, so slightly warmer as the week moves along. This appeared in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend. It's a really interesting piece. The author is named Andrew Machida. It says here he's the Dean of the College of International and Security Studies at the George Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. He has a very interesting take, and it deals with some of the societies and the cultures that we have seen that have experienced prior to this what we're experiencing now. Tearing down the statues, tearing down the culture, destroying our cultural images. In each instance, it's an attempt by a minority to subvert the will of the majority. I don't believe, this is me now, not the columnist, I don't believe most Americans hate America. But the people who do hate America are winning in their attempt to redefine what the nation is. Right to the point that it actually is possible that an out-and-out Marxist, a former communist trainer in Cuba, will be Joe Biden's running mate for president. Now, here's the column, and he starts by going back into the post-World War II era. He writes, Ajislaw Miszlaj, a future Pulitzer Prize-winning poet who had just defected from Poland, began work in 1951 in a book called The Captive Mind. Even as Stalinist totalitarianism tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, many Western European intellectuals lauded the brave new world of Soviet communism as a model for overcoming bourgeois forces, which in their view had caused World War II. Living in Paris, Milosz wrote his book, which was published in 1953, to warn the West of what happens to the human mind and soul in a totalitarian system. See, now this is good stuff. This guy is going back to point out that back in the 1950s, there were people who were trying to explain what was going to happen with communist expansionism and what it was going to do to gut not only our souls, but our minds. The column continues. Milosz knew from experience, having lived through the communist takeover, how totalitarianism strips men and women of their liberty, transforming them into affirmative cogs in service of the state, and obliterating what had taken centuries of Western political development to achieve. Totalitarianism not only enslaved people physically, but crippled their spirit. It did so by replacing ordinary human language. Now, again, I'm interjecting. Listen to the parallels to what we are experiencing right now this week, including the story that I just shared a moment ago. It did so by replacing ordinary human language, in which words signify things in the outside world, with ideologically sanctioned language, in which words signify the dominant party's ever-changing ideas of what is and is not true. Since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, nationwide protests, which quickly turned to riots, have been hijacked by the neo-Marxist left, morphing into an all-out assault on American cities and institutions. This assault is underpinned by an audacious attempt to rewrite history that turns specifically past events into weapons, not only to overpower political opponents, but also to recast all of American history as a litany of racial transgressions. Key line. That we have to recast history as nothing but a litany of racial transgressions. That what our history was is displaced by this new list that they come up with. Continues. The radicals have turned race into a lens through which the view of the country's history, and not simply because they are obsessed with race. They have done so because it allows them to identify and separate those groups that deserve affirmation, in their view, and those that do not. What is taking place is the resegregation of America, the end point of which will be the rejection of everything the civil rights movement stood for. Let me interject. See, this is where he's on to something. By breaking us into all of these groups where various people have been aggrieved, we end this notion of a colorblind society. We end the notion of equality. We end the notion of judging all people as individuals. No, the new movement's goal is to judge everybody on the basis of which group they are in, and certain groups that are deemed to be bad, they are going to be made to suffer because they deserve it. So much for equality. Back to the column. What is driving the radical protesters and rioters, who are enabled and manipulated by the digital intelligentsia in the press and an expanding segment of the political and business classes, is contempt for the freedom of anyone who fails to comport with their image of a just society. In authoritarian systems, those in power seek to proscribe certain forms of political speech and social activity. Totalitarians claim unconditional authority to reach deep into each person's conscience. They prescribe an interpretation of the world and dictate the language with which citizens are permitted to express that interpretation. Let me interject. Now, that's what he says happens in totalitarian societies. You see that this is exactly what's happening right now in the United States. You are only allowed to think certain things, and you are only allowed to say certain things. Back to the column. Authoritarian regimes leave largely untouched the private civic sphere of human activity. Totalitarians destroy traditional value systems and reorder the culture. That is why they are harder to overthrow. The ill-named progressivism that has inspired shrill demands to dismantle police forces and destroy statues is only a small manifestation of a massive project aimed at the re-education of the American population. The goal of this project is to negate the story of the American Republic and replace it with a tale anchored exclusively in race categories and narratives of oppression. The nature of this exercise, with its sledgehammer rhetoric that obliterates complexities in favor of one-dimensional correct interpretations, is as close to Marxist agitprop as one can get. In other words, American history isn't American history. American history is, here's what happened to blacks. Here's what happened to Native Americans. Here's what happened to this group. And single out only groups that had some level of oppression and make those experiences the only part of American history that ever existed. The conclusion, of course, America is a horrible, brutal, awful nation, and thus we've got to wreck and change everything we've ever believed in because it's horrible. In order to do this, and this is the goal, of course, of all people who send anyone to a re-education camp, you've got to literally blank out everything that was known before, every experience that we ever thought our nation had, and replace it with this new stuff. And as you see, it's happening right now at breathtaking pace. Now, when we come back after the break, I'm going to share with you the Sizzling Summer Cash Contest text-in word and share the second half of this column in which he points out that most Americans, I think, recognize this is wrong, but don't seem to have any idea as to what to do about it. News Talk, 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. First things first, I'm going to give you the Sizzling Summer Cash Contest text-in word for the 4 o'clock hour. The word for this hour is smile. You have until 5 p.m. to text in SMILE to 200-200. You get a text confirming entry, plus iHeartRadio info, standard and message rate supply in the nationwide contest. Somebody in the United States, maybe one of you, is going to win $1,000. I've been sharing with the audience a fascinating column, and what always happens after this is, can you tell I didn't catch who you said? First of all, we don't link up Wall Street Journal columns because we've had incredible bad luck with it over the years. Some get behind a paywall and so on. But for those of you who can access the Wall Street Journal, again, it's Andrew Michta's column. And I'm not going to repeat this 15 more times. Andrew Michta, M-I-C-H-T-A, that appeared over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal. The headline is The Captive Mind and America's Resegregation. He is sharing here what happens in totalitarian regimes and what is happening right now in the United States, in which we are moving aggressively toward totalitarianism. And where we left off, he said one of the things that totalitarians do at the beginning is they tell you what you are allowed to think and what you are allowed to say, and the next thing is they go back and they purge you of your history. And I mentioned that this is what happened in Russia, what happened in China. It's what happened in Castro's Cuba. They literally go into indoctrination and they do not share with you the actual reality of your history, but do a retelling that allows the history to be described as horrible. So therefore, whatever they want to do now is an attempt to right the wrongs, the terrible wrongs of the past. And it doesn't seem to matter if the masses disagree with this, because the masses don't have, in a totalitarian regime, any power. They're not allowed to have power. We'll pick up at that point in the column. Michta writes, why do American elites, who might be expected to favor preserving the nation that has elevated them, support the effort to dismantle it? Their thinking seems to be that the radicals destroying monuments and issuing wholesale denunciation of American past are wreaking destruction on ordinary Americans and their history, not on the elites and their ideology. In other words, he's saying, what do Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates care? This is ordinary Americans and their history. Look, we're in the now. What do we care about the past? We're thriving. We'll appease these people. What do we care? This is his point. He continues. Today's elites, as a rule, do not believe they have any obligation to serve the public, only to rule it. And so they express little or no disapproval of college students toppling statues on federal land or looters raiding supermarkets. To criticize them would open elites to the charge of populism and racism. That's true. You imagine a prominent liberal community leader or elected official condemning any of this stuff? They'll simply be called racist. They don't want to get in front of that train. So the elitists who have power because of what we have, this is my take now on the columnist, they're going to keep their mouths shut and they're going to sit back and allow this destruction of our culture and our heritage. The column continues, yet these elites are playing a dangerous game. Such canceling of historical and living figures alike increasingly mirrors what happened under communism in the Soviet bloc. I mentioned this earlier, where the accusation of being out of step with the party was enough to end one's career and nullify one's reputation. This is about more than statues in history. Those who control the symbols of political discourse can dominate the culture and control the collective consciousness. If you doubt this, ask yourself why there has been so little backlash from ordinary non-elite Americans. Now, this is where this column gets good. If you accept everything that he said, he then asked this question. All this has been going on. Why has there been so little backlash? Now, I think intuitively, we all know why there's been so little backlash. But this is the key to how totalitarians get their power. So he asks the question. I'm going to repeat what he writes. Ask yourself why there has been so little backlash from ordinary non-elite Americans. Our sense of self has been progressively deconstructed. We feel in our bones the wrongness of the violence being visited on the nation, but lack the language to speak against it. The resegregation of American society is fundamentally undemocratic and un-American. It envisions a social hierarchy based on DNA. It is also incompatible with individual freedom and constitutional government. Hence, the drive to overhaul the U.S. Constitution, rewrite the textbooks, and restructure museums by race and sex quotas. Democracy cannot survive in a society in which winners and losers are adjudicated arbitrarily according to criteria beyond individual control. Any society built around the principle of skin color will become a caste system in which accident, not merit, will allocate value and benefit. Civil society will be buried once and for all. The current radical trends carry the seeds of violence unseen in the U.S. since the Civil War. The activists ascendant in American cities insist on the dominance of their ideological precepts, brooking no alternative. Let me interject. They don't allow anyone to disagree with them at all, not even by nuance. Such absolutism forces Americans away from the realm of political compromise into one of unrelenting axiology, with one side claiming a monopoly on virtue and decency, while the other is expected to accept its status as perpetually evil and thus assume a permanent penitent stance for all its real and imagined misdeeds across history. Now let me interject. So in other words, if you're like a regular old white person who kind of loves America, because our country is premised entirely on sin. You have to be apologetic and you have to pay literally for the rest of your lives for all of this terribleness that we are. This again starts with defining that America is terrible and has been terrible. Once that becomes the establishment, now, well, it was your people that did it, so therefore now you have to go along with those of us who are trying to make us unterrible, or if you don't, being evil, we're going to have to keep punishing you. And you see again that this is what is happening now. And again leads to this point of people not knowing how to stop it. Back to the column. Only when the state creates a space for an unbiased debate over history can discussion truly take place unhindered by ideology and dogma. In other words, somebody like me wanting to argue that our country is the greatest country in the history of the world and the freedoms that we have created are more expansive than anywhere else. Only where someone like me and many of you are allowed to say this without being silenced because we're racist, we're bigots, we're this, that, or the other thing, can you actually have this debate. But this is me now and not the columnist. The left, the totalitarians, never want debate. Why do you think in every nation that goes totalitarian, they shut down the other side? Castro, the communists in Russia, the communists in China, they do not allow any type of dissent because they can't win the argument. Therefore, if you don't believe the way they now say that we're supposed to believe, you're obviously evil and a racist. They do not want this debate in which they are challenged. They simply hand stuff down and say you must think this way, and if you don't, you are evil. Makes it very hard to win an argument when the other side have said, merely for trying to argue, you're awful and horrible. Back to the column. Only when we have this type of debate can a society move toward a consensus on a shared understanding of its past and how its collective memory should be shaped. The United States is roiled by spasms of violence and intolerance today because government at all levels, public education systems, states that allow universities to promulgate speech codes and safe spaces, court decisions that define constitutionally protected speech as, in effect, everything but political speech, has abdicated its duty to protect the public space. Now, he's pointing out this started in the schools. When you wonder how these young people all turned out the way they were indoctrinated in the schools by radical teachers, mostly members of unions, who handed this stuff down. Then they got into universities where it got even worse. The universities, when they established the safe spaces and defined any speech that somebody doesn't like as being hate speech, they all, again, made it worse. So we don't have any kind of debate whatsoever. So he's mentioning where it started, the schools, the universities. Then it continues now where court decisions and others are suddenly proclaiming political speech as hate speech. Remember those statements? Free speech isn't hate speech. In fact, the whole point of free speech is to protect what somebody else thinks is hate speech. We've been premised on being a country in which you can pretty much say anything you doggone well like. And the reason that we established the protections was to stop somebody from shutting you up because your speech was offensive. And it usually was offensive to someone. Back to the column. Children are rampaging through the cities because the adults have left the room. A perfect example of this would be the cities where the police have simply stepped back and allowed people to riot. Portland, where the mayor joins the protesters. Portland, where you have a leading member of Congress, Nadler, saying that they aren't having any kind of problem that's going on out there. The adults, the people who were in place to maintain order and maintain control, left the room. The column then continues. America is in the throes of a destructive ideological experiment, subjected to a sweeping and increasing state-sanctioned reordering of its collective memory. What a lie. State-sanctioned reordering of its collective memory. In other words, the things that we remember, we're just going to make up something new. With the increasingly totalitarian left given free rein to dominate public discourse, Miloš, who died in 2004, would see an American mind bloated by a steady diet of identity politics and group grievance served up by ideologues in schools nationwide. It all begins in the schools. And again, I'll point out that we allowed this to happen. The parents who sat by for the last 25 or 30 years, where this ideological hackery went on from a bunch of union goons who were allowed to run roughshod over the curriculum and did nothing. And then we, the taxpayers, who allowed the university systems, University of Wisconsin system, tragically what you see going on right now with Marquette literally being wrecked as an institution of higher learning. We've all allowed it to happen. Just as we're going to be allowing most of what's to come to happen because we didn't know how to stop it. Back to the column. Let me pick up at that point. Miloš, who died in 2004, would see an American mind bloated by a steady diet of identity politics and group grievance served up by ideologies in schools nationwide. These ideologues have nearly succeeded in remaking our politics and culture. They are reinforced by a media in thrall to groupthink. That's true. The media, they all have to think exactly the same way. The media, which used to be the source that would question things and present all ideas, it's now a pack in which everyone thinks exactly the same. They've become the worst part of the institution rather than the challengers. Back to the column. A media enthralled to groupthink by credentialed bureaucrats and by politicians shaped in the monochrome factories of intellectual uniformity that are America's institutions of higher learning. Great line. Politicians shaped in the monochrome factories of intellectual uniformity that are America's institutions of higher learning. Everybody's got to think the same way at colleges and universities. If you try to dissent, you see what they try to do to you. You get the John McAdams treatment of Marquette. And the columnist Michta concludes. American society is faced with a stark binary choice. Either we push back against the unrelenting assault of the neo-Marxist narrative, or we yield to the totalitarian impulse now in full view in our politics. It is no longer enough to wait for the next election or to pin our hopes on a silent majority that will eventually stop the madness. There may be no such majority. If there is, its members may no longer be able to articulate what they see unfolding around them. Let me interject. This is how you become a good German. The statement of how did all of these Germans suddenly become supporters of the Nazis? You can argue that the Nazis never had full popular support, that the masses just caved because they didn't know what else to do. Back to the column. It is hard to call things by their proper names in a society whose elites insist on calling looters and arsonists protesters. National monuments, symbols of racism. And the victims of looting and arson, the beneficiaries of white privilege. The challenge is massive, but it starts with the simple act of calling things by their proper names. Column, brilliant. Appeared over the weekend, Wall Street Journal, and Michta. I've now cited his name 5 times. Is that enough for people to be able to track it down? So he's saying the first thing you have to do is reclaim the language. So stop calling the people in Portland protesters. They're looters and arsonists. When they kill somebody, start calling them murderers. Use the actual word that describes what it is that's going on. Describe the people who are ripping down our statues as vandals. Describe the people that are going back and try to rewrite our history. Call them deniers. That's what they are. In other words, use the language. There's a reason why they're trying to grab up the language. There's a reason why they are taking 3 words that in and of themselves seem benign, all lives matter, and just deciding that those are racist words. They are grabbing control of the language. And the rest of us literally don't know how to fight back. Michta says the way you have to start fighting back is by using the words that you're still allowed to say and accurately putting them in place to describe what you see happening in front of you. If a riot is going on, you can say that there's a riot even if the media won't call it a riot. If Joe Biden nominates a communist to be his vice presidential candidate, you can say this woman is a communist, even if the media says she's not and the PolitiFact newspaper says it's false. The woman was a trainer in Cuba, for heaven's sakes. Cuba. She's a communist. Well, but she really isn't anymore. Okay. She hasn't moved far to the right out there in California. We have to be willing, And I won't even say the old statement because that could be accused of racism. I'll just use a different suit from the card game. We have to be willing to call a club a club. You have to be willing to say when something is happening and when something is going on, use the exact words. And I don't mean tinged words. I don't mean hyping it up on your own. I don't mean exaggerating it on your own. I don't mean distorting it. But when we live in a world in which health officers can issue edicts that in the past were reserved for dictators of nations, we've lost something. And when we aren't willing to describe the actions of those health officers for what they are, tyrannical, we've ceded control of the language, even if you agree or for that matter disagree with the edicts that they put out. When you see the type of goon squads that are running around right now in communities, terrifying citizens like in Greenfield for a guy who just put a sign in his yard saying he supports the Greenfield police. We have to be willing to describe that for what it is. It's a goon squad. That's what a goon would do. The language. Grabbing it back. That was a long time, but that was supposed to be the first extended segment of the program. And in fact, it was. I have, by totally weird coincidence on today's show, two totally separate and unrelated stories. They have nothing to do with one another. They're about the same church. This is it. It's utter coincidence. I hope it's not in Cedarburg. I didn't even say there. Just by total coincidence, it would be like if I just on the same day had two separate and unrelated stories about like a croquet team in Kenosha. Anyway, that's still to come. 429 News Talk 1130 WS. Standing up for Milwaukee, this is the Mark Belling Late Afternoon Show on News Talk 1130 WISN. This is a little bit of a PS. I got this from a listener. In fact, I've been getting these things all day. Stuff like this. But this weekend was wild up north. I've heard this from a lot of people. The reason places, when I say up north, I'm now sounding like what in Milwaukee. It sounded like I essentially mean the Fox family and on up. And as somebody who grew up in the Fox family, we would always hate it when people thought we were up north. No, up north is always north of wherever you are. If you're in Crandon, you think up north is like the UP. Anyway, I think you actually took one extra vacation somewhere north of here this year because there's nothing else to do, right? In Lakewood, Wisconsin, and that was probably in lieu of other things to do. This is what's been going on all over. People are just doing more. Go to northern Wisconsin, go to places that you can go because there's nothing else to do and nothing else to spend money on. Anyway, from a listener, he said that the Northwoods were packed. It's been going up every weekend, and I'll read his thing. No masks, bars open, bands, large crowds, total defiance. Traffic was nuts going south on Sunday. Again, I mentioned overwhelming support in these public opinion polls for these mask requirements, and I'm willing to bet that a lot of the people who said that they support a mask requirement were the people that were out, packed at some of these places, and they weren't wearing any face masks. What people say is not necessarily what they are going to do. When this stuff like this shows up at Facebook, like the event that occurred in Oshkosh over the weekend, some people go nuts, but the people that were putting themselves in harm, if that's what not wearing a mask is, or the ones you would think ought to be able to decide for themselves. The others say, well, they're going to get infected, then they're going to affect the rest of us, which would then become grounds to control everything that someone does, which is par for the course for really everything we discussed in the first segment of the program. We're going to shift gears. I've been mentioning on the show, and part of this is the media has an agenda, and the other part is nobody in the media knows what they're doing anymore in Milwaukee. I mean, they're mostly young. They don't have any sources. They're all working at home. They wait for something from the assignment editor. This debate over the future of Chief Morales. I've worked this in because I still have my ear to the ground, and I know what's going on. I have mentioned repeatedly there is overwhelming support for the chief in the Latino community, and there is a big split coming here. If some black leaders succeed in getting Morales fired, a police chief widely supported and beloved in the Latino community. It isn't just people in the Latino community. Virtually everybody who knows Morales really, really likes the guy. I haven't seen anywhere in the media any stories indicating the anger that is being fueled in Milwaukee's Latino community over what they believe to be the persecution of Chief Morales. Just as I've seen almost no stories about the very low level of participation in some of the protest marches by Latinos. I didn't say none. It's been low. Well, this might force the issue. Today, an open letter was sent to Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett, signed by 280 community leaders. The main signer is Teresa Mercado, who is a well-known activist, isn't the right word, well-known figure in Milwaukee. She runs, we don't have the ethnic festivals this year. What's the one? The Latino Festival. Is it called? It's not the right group. It's going to come to me in a minute. I want to name her correctly. The Mexican Fiesta. That's what that event is called. And that group also runs the Hispanic Scholarship Foundation. Teresa Mercado is the main signer, but it has 280 signatures on here, many Latino, but not everybody. You can't always tell by somebody's name, but there are quite a few names on here that wouldn't be Latino, but it's 280 people, many of whom are well known, and I'm going to read it. Dear Mayor Barrett, we are writing to call on you to exercise your power as mayor of Milwaukee with oversight of the Fire and Police Commission to immediately overrule the directives issued by the FPC as given authority to you to do so by the Wisconsin state statutes. Furthermore, we implore you to call for a full investigation of the FPC, appoint an interim FPC chair, allowing time for the Ethics Board to conclude its investigation and a chairman, Dave Ogas, and conduct broad-based community listening and information sessions to understand what changes, improvements, and continuances the public would like to see from the Milwaukee Police Department. I'll interject. For those of you not aware, Stephen Ogas is the chairman of the Fire and Police Commission. He wants to get Morales fired. He pushed through these directives that he knows that no ethical chief could ever follow through on. Ogas is the guy who was found in an ethics investigation guilty of lying to a former United States attorney who was conducting the investigation about Ogas's intervention into a sexual assault investigation involving a prominent Milwaukee developer. Back to the letter. We feel that the recent directives provided to Chief Morales clearly demonstrate the need for checks and balances on the FPC's actions during a time frame of intense pressure which has resulted in no transparency or a public informed process. We call on you to show true leadership and not allow any one force to run over the interests of the public and full transparency. Please understand that silence is not a neutral position. Silence is generally Tom Barrett's only position. Silence is not a neutral position. We are concerned that your silence and absence from the dialogue to date sends the message that qualified Hispanic appointments need not apply to represent their community and city government. They bring up the Hispanic card here. It's interesting. It continues. The Fire and Police Commission's activity has been in disarray since last year. There have been calls for greater transparency by aldermen, commissioners, and other elected officials. Calls for the resignations of the chair, calls for launching an investigation into the commission, as well as now a formal ethics investigation into the chair. Its recent actions lacked transparency and public input and reek of ulterior motive. We urge you to remove doubt of impropriety by reappointing a different chair, allowing a real review to take place of Chief Morales' performance, and launching an independent community process to understand the public concerns with MPD, with Chief Morales, and most importantly, what reforms the inclusive Milwaukee community is calling for in our law enforcement. It is clear to everyone that the recent actions of the FPC are part of a pre-planned, coordinated political attack. Wow. So they're coming right out and saying that they've been laying for Morales, and they're using the recent controversy over the protests as an attempt to get him. Let me read that sentence again. It is clear to everyone that the recent actions of the FPC are part of a pre-planned, coordinated political attack. We hope and trust that with this public request, we can restore a higher level of ethical standards and transparency in regard to such an important issue for the future safety of our community. We look forward to your renewed leadership in this area and your announcement of overruling the FPC's directives. And as I said, there's 280 signers of this, and obviously I can't read them all. And this thing's going to be out there and get a lot of media. I mean, I can't even imagine that the media won't pick up on it. But it was sent out by Teresa Mercado, who's the president of Wisconsin Hispanic Scholarship Fund and a well-known member of the community. As I say, there's a lot of signers on this thing, including quite a few names that prominent Milwaukeeans would recognize. And they're essentially saying that these directives that were given to the chief, no use of tear gas, no use of pepper spray. I mean, for heaven's sakes, what if we do have a riot? What are you supposed to do? The only alternative then is to shoot to kill. I mean, they can't use your non-lethal force and so on. They're putting out directives that they know that Chief Morales can't abide by. And then when he doesn't follow them, use that as the excuse to fire him with cause. Remember, Morales is in the middle of a contract. He can only be fired for cause. So they give him a bunch of directives that they know that he can't follow, so they can turn around and fire him for cause. And the point of the letter from these community leaders is that this is all an attempt by an ethically challenged Fire and Police Commission chair and a handful of others to get rid of a chief that they don't like. You're now seeing the backlash finally come from the support that Morales has always had. And I've been mentioning this on my show, even though nobody in the media has been picking up on how horrified many leaders are, especially in the Latino community, over the treatment of Morales, who I would say in the time that I have, that's not even controversial. I'm going to say in the time that I've been here, that actually doesn't even take in that many chiefs. Morales is the most supported and admired police chief that we have. It is a handful of critics that have been on him, and they're the ones that are getting their way. We have never had a Milwaukee police chief who had the overwhelming support of the rank and file. Part of the job of the rank and file is to bitch about the chief. I mean, police unions complain about chiefs everywhere. They complained about Breyer. He has the overwhelming support of the chief. He has the overwhelming support of community leaders. He has the overwhelming support of the business community. I don't think that the problems that are cited in the black community really exist. I think he has a problem with protesters who wish that he would allow them to riot, which he didn't. There's a reason we didn't become Portland. We didn't become Seattle. We didn't become Chicago. We showed just enough force to keep things in check, but gave them just enough room that they could run around and go out there and do all of their protests. You have a police chief that's assembled an outstanding command staff that has the support of his department in a city in which police officers are getting nothing but crap right now, and Morales has held all of this together. In the meantime, the Fire and Police Commission, which is the Citizens Oversight Board, is run by a guy who was found to have lied in an ethics investigation of his own failed ethics. A guy who went in and inappropriately intervened in the interrogation of a prominent Milwaukeean who was being investigated for sexual assault. And it still has a bug up his butt that investigation ever in fact occurred, that victims apparently are not allowed to file reports with the Milwaukee Police Department. In the meantime, Tom Barrett, and this is the point of this leader, sits back and does nothing. Nobody knows what side he's on this. I mean, it is widely known that Barrett did not want Morales to be the police chief. He wanted the other finalist, Michael Brunson. Both, by the way, would have been outstanding picks. And the Fire and Police Commission chose Morales. It was a divided vote. He won by one vote. Barrett had a hissy fit, replaced several members of the commission. After that, he replaced the executive director. So has he been laying for Morales ever since? The thing I heard from the beginning is that Barrett just did not want a Republican police chief in place during the Democratic National Convention. Well, now the Democratic National Convention, who even knows what it's going to be in a couple of weeks in terms of having any kind of importance at all. But that's what drove some of this stuff in the first place. Plus, mayors have always wanted police chiefs that they can control. It's impossible to get it once you give them a contract, but they've always wanted that, and there was that hang-up. But now we've gotten to the point where Morales has been on the job. He's done an outstanding job. Nobody can understand why anybody would want to get rid of him. He's done everything in his power to control the various tinderboxes that are out there. You've got violent crime in the city, out of control, protests going on like crazy, the whole COVID thing going on, a department that is demoralized by seeming lack of public support, and a chief who's held all of this together. And then you have a fire and police commission led by a guy who doesn't even know how to tell the truth to an investigator, trying to fire him, and the mayor sitting back there hiding under the couch. And this letter is an attempt to get the mayor out from under the couch. I also think the reason that they're putting this thing out publicly is there's been a sense of frustration that nobody in the media was reporting it privately, even though, as I say, I mean, when I learn things because people are whispering in my ear, that means they'd be whispering in the ear of any other reporter. If you could find a reporter who had ears, that's the problem. Who has ears? Who are you supposed to give it to? I mean, Dan Bice, Charles Benson, name a fourth reporter in this city. You know, and if you're not whispering in one of their two ears or they're preoccupied with something else, you know, and there's an extent as to how far my influence goes because everybody knows I'm not neutral. I have a point of view on the program. But as I can tell, I've been telling you, and I've been slipping it into the show. Look, Morales is a strong supporter of the Latino community, and for a lot of other people, they're very, very upset what's going on. How many times have you heard me say this? Well, now they're forcing it, and it's out there, and 200 people signed their names to this letter. 280 people. Yeah, Paul says add Dan O'Donnell to the list. In terms of actual mainstream reporters, not opinion, they pick up on nothing. They pick up on nothing. That groupthink that was referred to in the last hour, that's the way it is. Well, let's just report what everybody else reports. You can't distinguish. When those protests were going on, if you would have switched from channels 4, 6, 12, or 58, you could not distinguish one station from the other in terms of they even have the same camera shots. And then the same cautions from the anchors. Oh, go somewhere where it's safe. Very, very similar to what's happening with the national news media and its coverage, for example, of Trump. This talk 1130 WYSN, Mark Bellering, late afternoon show. This is from our You Can't Make It Up department. If you've been following the news, many people believe that Joe Biden is going to choose Karen Bass, who is a member of Congress from California, as his vice presidential running mate. I think it's a trial balloon. I think they're sending out all these stories that it's Bass to see how it plays. They put her on the weekend talk show circuit over the weekend, and she was forced to answer for some of the extreme radical positions and things that she's done in her past. This woman was a trainer of militants in Cuba. She was younger then. Okay. She was younger then. She's rather old now. Compared to Joe Biden, she's a spring chicken, but she's rather old now. She's 66. She did in the past praise the Church of Scientology, which has been widely viewed as a cult and linked to all sorts of sexual abuses of its members. When asked about her praise for the Church of Scientology and its founder, L. Ron Hubbard, she said, well, in my district, they're putting up a church. I said nice things about them. But what about her statement? And remember, she was a trainer in Cuba. What about her statement about Fidel Castro? Karen Bass put out a statement praising Fidel Castro some time ago. Describing the high regard that she held him in and what an important and vital world figure he has been and what a liberator he was for his people. Karen Bass went on the weekend talk show circuit, as I said over the weekend, and was asked about that. She was on Chris Wallace's Fox News Sunday. She said, well, I wouldn't have said that now. I absolutely would not have put that statement out. Lesson learned. Would not do that again for sure. She then said that she now understands that Castro's leadership was a brutal regime. She said she didn't really know then that Castro's regime was a brutal regime. You know, when she said this, you're thinking, well, was she 25 and didn't know any better? 4 years ago! She is 62! In 2016, Fidel Castro had been in charge of Cuba for 47 years. And she didn't pick up on all of that time that it was a brutal regime, but now that statement might be used against her in an attack ad, given the fact that everybody knows that Joe Biden's running mate would become the president of the United States. Oh, and to say that, I just didn't know. She actually was in Cuba training militants, but didn't pick up on any of that. This could be our president. So say, we're at a point in which it's impossible to make up anything anymore. Here's an interesting turn on a story. I admit I didn't see this one coming. The left is after Deborah Birx. They love Fauci. They want Birx out. They think Birx is too pro-Trump and that Birx has been willing to allow guidance to come from her office that fits in the political agendas of Donald Trump, and she got attacked over the weekend by Nancy Pelosi. Asked on ABC's This Week if she has confidence in Birx, Pelosi said, I think the president has been spreading disinformation about the virus, and she is his appointee, so I don't have confidence in there. No. Watch this one develop over the next few weeks where the left goes after Deborah Birx and leaves Fauci alone. For whatever reason, she's gotten in the crosshairs, and I suspect, A, her military background is part of it, and B, she hasn't been as willing as Fauci. Fauci talks out of the side of his mouth, kind of ripping Trump as every chance that he gets. Birx has not been doing that. I'll admit I didn't see this coming. I saw Birx and Fauci kind of as together. It may well be that Birx is far less political and more science-based than Fauci is. Anyway, the left wants her out. I want to work in one more item in this segment. We have this election coming up a week from tomorrow. That's election day. Obviously, you can vote in person all week. And I've been asked by a lot of people to weigh in on some of these various races. The most noteworthy races are the race for Congress in the old Jim Sensenbrenner district. He's not running for re-election, in which you have a Republican primary between Scott Fitzgerald and Cliff DeTemple. Scott Fitzgerald's advantage is that he hit the ground immediately running. He would immediately know the process and would be extremely effective. And he has been a very strong voice for conservative values in his many years in the Wisconsin state legislature. The downside to him would be he is an insider at a time that a lot of people are looking for outsiders. On the other hand, especially if you fear that the Republicans are going to lose the presidency, you're going to want to have an opposition in Congress that knows how to fight the good fight. Cliff DeTemple, so far as I can tell, is an outstanding political candidate. He'd be an outstanding member of Congress, but he clearly lacks experience in the process, and there'd be a learning curve that would be there. I would not offer a recommendation in that race. I think both are excellent candidates. There are a number of state legislative races that are out there as well. We have a race for the state assembly in a district that vitally needs to be turned over to the Republican side, where there's a Democratic incumbent. It's the district that includes about equal parts Brookfield and Wauwatosa. And the Democratic candidate won a narrow victory the last time around. There is a Republican primary. Bonnie Lee is the conservative. Linda Boucher is the rhino. Boucher is a Walker recall signer who has publicly advocated for no punishment, even for chronic repeat drunk drivers, which may have something to do with the fact that that would describe her husband, and has generally not shown much support for conservative principles. Bonnie Lee is by far the best candidate in that race. We have a race in Ozaukee County for the state assembly where, again, the Democrats know they can't win a general election, so they put up a candidate to run in the Republican primary. What do you call him, Reamer the Rhino or something? Reamer the Rhino, he's running against the established Republican incumbent who's, give me his name here real quick, Rob Brooks. There is a very important state Senate election, and this essentially is an election because the district's overwhelmingly Republican. You've heard candidate Julian Bradley run ads on this program. He has other candidates, some of whom seem qualified, some of whom I'm not sure about. Julian Bradley is the gold standard in that race. And at a time in which we need to challenge this narrative that America is a terribly racist nation, to have perhaps the most conservative member of the entire state Senate be a Republican African American would be of significant value. And In districts that are overwhelmingly Republican, I think it's extremely important to choose the most conservative candidate that can win the seat. And by my analysis of that race, Bradley would fit that category. There's other elections out there, other races and so on, but those would be the big ones that I would want to address at this point. One of the things that we all know about media reporting on COVID-19 is bad news will be reported, good news will not. Some people would suggest that I'm only reporting some of the better news. Well, if that's the case, it's only because I'm trying to focus on some of the things that you may not be aware of because the media chooses not to cover them. Now, we know that in some states, especially in the southern part of the United States, over the last number of weeks, there was a spike in positive tests. It occurred at the same time that a real heat wave hit the South. No one's really sure why that happened. There is a fair amount of thinking that people were forced indoors, and indoors is where this thing is going to be spread, especially when you've got a bunch of people living indoors and are close to one another. If we've learned anything from the baseball experience, it is that when you have people that are sharing locker rooms, hanging around close together and so on, they're likelier to spread this than two people walking down the street past one another. So if more people were forced indoors, that might be an explanation. Anyway, this also occurred at the same time that there was a significant increase in testing. And as we've seen in Wisconsin, the more tests you do, the more positive cases that you're going to get. I happen to believe that in Wisconsin, we have not had any increase in the occurrence of this virus. I believe it's been the same for some number of months. I believe we had a spike in April, which was seen in the hospitalization numbers, and it's been flat ever since. The reason we have more cases now is we're doing more testing. So, some stories to report. There's a new study that now shows, this is from Digital Journal, and they quote an academic study that was done. Let me get the source for it. It was a test of people in Lombardy, Italy. And in Italy, the population is much older and with a lot of recurring health conditions. They do find that 70% of the people who have the virus are asymptomatic. In other words, 70% of the people who test positive aren't sick. Yet you're hearing this reference when somebody tests positive, you've got these people that are sick. Sick should mean sick. Simply testing positive for the virus doesn't mean that you are sick. It means you have the virus. There can be a distinction. This would also explain why so many people go in and get tested and they're shocked to find out that they're positive. So I believe what's happened in Wisconsin is as we test more people, you get a higher number of positives that come in. Many have asked why the numbers are fluctuating so much day to day. Well, we now know why this is. There's this huge backlog of results. You get a big dump from one county of all of their negative tests in one day. Suddenly the percentages go way down. There is a real garbage in, garbage out factor. With that, I want to share, and again, it's anecdotal. It doesn't mean anything other than what it means. But a guy contacted me to say he knows two people who went in for a COVID test in southeastern Wisconsin. He says neither of the people know each other. They just both know him, and they told him this story independently. Both people said they filled out the paperwork while they were in line but gave up and went home because the lines were brutal. And he said both people, independent of one another, told him they got letters in the mail saying that their test came back and they were positive. They didn't do tests. Whether people are deliberately fudging the numbers or this is just a complete, what I just think this is the same thing going on at the Office of Workforce Development in Wisconsin with the processing of the unemployment compensation stuff. The paperwork is a mess. The numbers are a mess. They're all backlogged. They're throwing out all sorts of stuff that turns out not to be real. So they have two people fill out the thing. They don't come back as a negative, so they just decide to report them as a positive because they're not negative. So you got a lot of bad numbers that are in here that may be fouling up the system. And finally, this is the story that, again, perhaps it's been reported somewhere. I've not seen it in the mainstream media. We know that Arizona and Florida had huge spikes several weeks ago. Here's what I haven't seen reported. The positive test numbers in both those states have crashed. They're back down to where they were before this spike occurred. So the surge in cases in Arizona and Florida, which may have been accompanied by the front end of the heat wave, Doesn't fully explain it because it's still hot in Arizona. Those numbers have gone way, way, way down. So it may have been that the bug moved through portions of that state. Lots of people went in for testing, but the Arizona and Florida numbers are now way down again. All you have to do is go to the websites in those individual states, take a look at the number of positive tests per day, do one of those charts that goes, like it's the lower side of the camel hump coming down again. The conclusions that I draw are all based on what is happening and what has happened, and not on what I have felt in the future would happen. My belief is that coronavirus is going to be with us for a long, long time. That it's going to just be something that we have, and it's never going to spike into real, actual public health crisis numbers. I don't think we are ever going to get to a point of massive deaths. I don't think we are ever going to get to a point where the hospitals are overrun. I think it's just going to be a thing that some people get sick from, in the same way we got 97 zillion other things that people are going to get sick from. So the people that are postponing and canceling and doing this, that, and the other thing because an increase in tests, they have no end game for this at all, because I don't think this virus is going away. And even with a vaccine, I don't think that vaccine will be 100% effective, and I'm not sure that a vaccine will knock the virus out permanently. It might only give you limited protection, which is true of a lot of them. So, I think the thing is what it is. Unfortunately, we have not been willing to observe actually what it is, even though the evidence is right there in front of us. We're going to have spikes. They're not going to result in significant increase in death, but there will be some deaths, and they're going to occur by region when something moves through. And, obviously, the more tests you do, the more positives you're going to get. In the meantime, general observation that people have, the state of Wisconsin remains one of the best states in the nation. Our numbers of deaths per population is one of the best in the country. Our hospitalization rate remains flatlined. As of right now, we're at 294 in Wisconsin. We've been generally below 300 for weeks. So even though the media keeps reporting this incredible increase in tests, there's not been an increase in number of people getting sick, because if they did, the hospital numbers would be higher than they are. On the other hand, the number of people getting sick is not going down. This frustrates people who thought that it would, but our hospital numbers, which did grow into the 100s, are now back into the 200s. There's this kind of steady line. Couple hundred people or so being sick enough to go to the hospital. Only a small number need to be in the ICU. Generally, they're out of the hospital in a day or so, and unfortunately, a very small number of these people, and in Wisconsin, we're still under 1,000 deaths. They do pass away, and they're usually people with pre-existing conditions. And finally, the part of the story that nobody has been willing to look into because there's a media bias is how many of these cases that are classified as COVID deaths are doing so by the hospitals because they get extra money for the COVID patients. They do get that. The reimbursement rate is higher for a COVID patient than for someone else. When someone has 9 other things, are we going to stick them in the COVID category when any one of those 9 things might have been the thing that knocked them over in the end anyway, because the hospitals, broke as they are fighting for a higher level of reimbursement? If you are not in a high-risk category, and if you are under 60, that's 2 ifs, but they're ifs. I still say this is something for which you have very little to be worried about beyond any other kind of thing that we all could get, of which I've gotten quite a few. I've been doing decluttering. My allergies are going crazy. I mean, one sister thinks it's dust mites because I have all the symptoms of that. Another one thinks that I still have some nerve sense. They're just, who knows? The point that I make, okay, that's a rather rare thing to get, but it's driving me crazy. It's miserable. I go to doctors over the whole thing. It's just awful. What am I supposed to do to avoid these types of things? I have this phobia with regard to COVID out of all proportion to the fact that there are 97 zillion other things that are also all out there, and the only way to avoid all of them is to simply die now, which is an answer to nothing. It could be that too. I'm allergic to everything. I mean, the weird thing is none of the sinus allergies have acted up. It's just, right now, if you touch me, I'll just scream in pain. Now I'll get people in the audience that'll call in with their homemade. I've laid on me every kind of goop that there is. Camphor, calamine, the tea tree oils and all of that stuff. And Oh, yes, I understand. Have you tried taking Benadryl? Duh, how dumb do you think I am? We'll get it fixed. You know, the thing you don't want is the thing that works, and that's prednisone. You know about prednisone, don't you? Yeah, you don't want to take it, but boy, doesn't it work? Yeah, see, it's like the COVID thing, though. Okay, I don't want to put the mask on and stay in the basement for the next 90. I stay in the basement for the next 9 months. I probably won't get the COVID in the next. I don't want to go to the basement. Standing up for Milwaukee, this is the Mark Belling Late Afternoon Show on News Talk 1130 WISN. I want to weigh in very briefly on the TikTok story. First of all, I just beg some technology company to give a normal name to itself. I mean, but and it's just part of the thing. If you don't have a dorky name, you're not considered like a tech company. TikTok is one of the most important social media companies in the world. It is owned by the Chinese. Given the fact that we know of the deteriorating relationship between the United States and China and the amount of espionage China has been doing, there are legitimate fears. This isn't just made up stuff. We know that they've already done it. And we've caught Chinese in the United States spying for their government. There is concern that the Chinese are going to use TikTok to spy on Americans. Remember, when you go on one of these social media platforms, they have access to everything that you are doing online. And given the fact that the TikTok is controlled by the Chinese, President Trump is threatening to ban TikTok in the United States. We have moved into social media far more quickly than we have considered the ramifications of it. I think of the number of Americans that were horrified when they found out that Facebook and Google were spying on them and putting cookies and following them all around the computer and so on. And they demanded, oh, don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other thing. Well, they sort of denied having done it in the first place, and they sort of didn't, but it's just logical that if you go on the platform of a website, you're exposing yourself to them, just as you goofs that are out there watching on these porno websites. The porno sites are all over you the moment that you go into them. They know you're there. You got to be very, very careful of the things that you're doing in our online world. When you are linking yourself to them, it's the same as you're calling them up on the phone. You not only hear them, they hear you. Well, it's one thing to be concerned about Facebook and Google. It's taking it to a higher level when you're talking about the Chinese government that is in, maybe right now, a Cold War with the United States. There have been discussions that Microsoft might buy the American operations of TikTok. It'd be one way of dealing with this. But again, I think President Trump, who will get no credit for this, is correct in being wary of this. For all the concern that was expressed about the Russians intervening in the 2016 election, something that didn't happen, the media wants to be completely unconcerned about the ongoing Chinese intervention in the 2020 election, because obviously the Chinese desperately want Trump to lose so they can go back to the good old days of walking all over us. Let's move forward. I said, by bizarre coincidence, and actually those two stories don't have anything to do with one another. I have two stories about the same church. Some months ago, in fact, now a couple of years, an allegation came out that I discussed on the program, and we have covered this story off and on from time to time as it has very slowly played itself to the news. A Roman Catholic priest, the pastor of Queen of Apostles in Pewaukee, his name is Father Chuck Hanno, was accused by a girl who is a member of his parish of him molesting her in the confessional. This resulted in criminal charges of one of the degrees of sexual assault against Father Hanno. For those of you who listen to me all the time, you are aware that after evaluating the story, I urge the audience to show great caution before assuming that the allegations were true, even though there were criminal charges. Now, I base those comments on the time on one of the biases that I have that serves me well. generally, perverts don't act perverted once. It's like any other behavior. There tends to be a pattern. If I hear someone accused of doing and then anything, and it's never happened before and nobody else has ever accused them of it, I take pause. On the other hand, if the person is known to have done that, whatever that thing is, 35 times before, you're likely to believe it's true. That doesn't mean the person accused 35 times did do this 36. Maybe somebody's making it up because they're an easy mark. It also doesn't mean that no pervert has never done something for the first time, because everyone has to do something for the first time. There are people who do things out of character. It doesn't automatically mean it's false. But it's my starting point. When I saw that there had been no other allegations either from this parish or anywhere else against Father Hannell, and when I read the specifics of this allegation, unusual. Sexual perverts, people who take advantage of children, wouldn't tend, I would think, to do it in a confessional with a number of people waiting outside to have their own confessions heard. And in this case, the girl's own father waiting in the church for her to come out. The chance of the victim simply screaming, it would seem to me to not be the way a predator would normally operate. And if we know anything about the long history of predators, including those that exist within the Catholic Church, there tends to be this slow building up and grooming and all of this stuff, and not just all of a sudden go and start grabbing somebody. It seemed odd. The components of the story seemed odd. The story was not reported to the authorities for some long time after. The priest, in fact, had scheduled himself to go on a sabbatical having nothing to do with this by the time that the allegations were finally brought forward. And I said at the time, I just have some doubts about this because of the lack of any other instances that we had been aware of any, and the archdiocese said they went to no other allegate from anyone. Just this. Despite this, the Waukesha County District Attorney's Office, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Thurston, believed the accuser and brought criminal charges against Father Hannell despite any lack of substantiating evidence. Were they feeling pressure to not sweep a perverted priest case under the rug, given that there have been numerous of those cases that were swept under the rug forever? If so, you're allowing history to judge a case in the present. To automatically assume, well, this priest is a pervert because a lot of priests were perverts, is the same terrible mistake that people have made in the past, judging someone else to be guilty of something because they're part of a larger group of people who have done the same thing. As the story played itself out and the case went to trial, a mistrial was declared in the middle of the case when it was revealed in court that the alleged victim's mother is an illegal immigrant. Somehow, the Waukesha County District Attorney's Office either never informed the defense of this or did such a poor investigation that it was unaware of this. Why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant for a huge reason, unique to cases of sexual assault. One of the criteria by which an adult can remain in the United States, even if they came here illegally, is if their child is a victim of a sexual assault while in the country. Now, that odd provision makes sense when you think about it. Let's suppose you have an illegal immigrant who is here and their child is victimized. Clearly, this is a time in which you would look at extenuating circumstances and be more concerned about the child victim and what's good for them, rather than, okay, let's deport every time of trauma, need for services, etc. But that component is there. This was not disclosed, so a mistrial was declared. But we now have, without saying that this means that the alleged victim was lying, we have a major motivation for this story to come out of the blue and out of nowhere. There is another component to the story that I have been hesitant to report. And I don't know if anyone else in the media has reported it, but I don't believe they have. Again, possibly some did, and I'm aware, I don't count blogs and so on because you can't keep track of them. I am going to withhold information here because I don't want to identify the victim. However, everyone in the church community knows who's made the allegation because everyone knows who this mother is, who's the illegal immigrant and so on. So her identity is widely known in that community. I am not going to name the victim, even though she is a child, even though the allegations may well have been made up. So therefore, in sharing this piece of information, I am going to withhold some information. Several months ago, the alleged victim's father, the guy who claimed that he was in the church at the time that his daughter supposedly was molested when in the confessional, was himself accused of sexual assault. It has nothing to do with this child and nothing to do with this church. It was completely different, and it had to do with an incident that occurred workplace related. The story has been widely reported in the news. What has not been widely reported is that he is the father of the child who made the allegation against Father Hannell, and that he is the husband of the mother who was the illegal immigrant, which created the motivation to tell the story about the allegation, if indeed the allegation was false. That is a lot of baggage on a case. You have a clear motivation for the alleged victim to make the story up. The father, who said that the girl reported this incident to him immediately, we now see is an accused criminal himself. And again, accused, he's not been convicted. And a case in which everyone who knew the priest, Father Hannell, said that they had never heard of any kind of behavior like this against him. Again, I'm not naming the father because it would name the girl here, and if she was put up to this by her parents, I can also tell you that there has been another story in the news that occurred within that family that was tragic, that occurred at an earlier time. Girl has had some tough issues in life and now is facing the reality that her own father is facing a criminal charge. And again, people in the community know who she is. I'm just not going to name any of them. But you add all of this together and weigh it against the fact that there have been no other accusations against this priest ever, and no physical evidence, and nobody who came out of the confessional yelling and screaming at the time or nothing. The only conclusion that I can draw is that this priest was falsely accused and has gone through hell on earth by a false allegation, and a public that was willing to believe it because they assume, well, you got all these perverted priests out there, this one's probably guilty too, rather than judge this case by its own unique set of circumstances and facts. I generally support prosecutors, and I generally think that when people are charged with a crime, it's because they're guilty. But I'm also aware that there's a reason why we build in all these safeguards in the criminal justice system, because sometimes people are wrongly accused. I think that this prosecution by the Waukesha County District Attorney's Office is indefensible. They didn't have enough evidence to bring this case to trial in the first place, and to not even know that there was a motivation in place for the girl to make up the allegation, this illegal immigration issue with the mother, indicates a lack of thoroughness. And it reflects badly on that office. It may be a one-off for the ADA that was involved, and maybe he just made a bad call. But when you're making bad calls like this and threatening to destroy the reputation of an innocent person and put him in prison, you got to be awfully doggone careful about those bad calls. In any event, there is a conclusion to this story. The Milwaukee Catholic Archdiocese has issued a statement to the parish. It was written by Archbishop Jerome Listecki. I'm going to read the first two paragraphs. Dear parishioners and friends of Queen of Apostles Parish, again, this is Pewaukee. Thank you for your patience and prayers these past 2+ years as the allegations against your pastor, Father Chuck Hannell, has been investigated and pursued, first by civil authorities and then by the Archdiocese's own independent investigation. I want to share this update with you about Father Hannell. I am happy to let you know that the investigation has been completed and that the report against Father Hannell has been considered not only unsubstantiated, but false. So the Archdiocese is now stating that the allegation was simply not true. This is going beyond, well, they didn't prove anything. This is saying they believe, based on their investigation, that he did not do this. The Archdiocese explains why the priest was put on a leave of absence during this entire period of time, despite the dubious nature of the charges. The Archdiocese of Pewaukee takes any report of clergy sexual abuse of a minor very seriously, as did Father Hannell, who agreed to step aside as your pastor to allow for a thorough investigation. Following Archdiocesan policies, the report against Father Hannell was first reviewed by the District Attorney's Office. As you know, charges were filed and a trial began. However, the court, upon the recommendation of the District Attorney, dismissed the case after several witnesses had testified. With the conclusion of the civil proceedings and also in accordance with archdiocesan policies, the next step was to have the matter reviewed by an independent investigator who determined that the allegation was false. The results of the investigation were studied by the Diocesan Review Board, who recommended that Father Hannell should be restored to ministry. I have accepted that recommendation and have informed Father Hannell that he is fully restored to the ministry effective August 3rd and may resume his role as your pastor. He will be back in church saying Mass at that church in Pewaukee next week. Anybody can make up something about anybody. This case, to me, from the beginning, there are certain allegations that come out. They're almost always of a sexual nature. And the media is so willing to believe them. And I'm not saying that we should automatically look the opposite on sexual allegations. But the Duke Lacrosse case rape, the Virginia Tech case, some of the others in which allegations were made that were proven to be false, there were problems from this one from the very, very beginning. And when those problems exist, they shouldn't be perceived as the automatic gospel truth. This would be very similar to the allegations that we often see of individuals who claim that they are the victims of dubious racial attacks. There's a case that still has not been resolved in Madison that has, as I mentioned on the program last week, I don't know if it happened or not, but there are reasons to be very cautious about believing it happened, including the fact that the victim herself and her family immediately asked for privacy, and that the authorities, despite a massive investigation, haven't found any suspects at all into what happened there. We jump on these things and immediately assume the worst. In some cases, there's overwhelming evidence to believe the worst, but when there isn't, we do need to take a deep breath. As I said, by bizarre coincidence, would you believe that the next segment also deals with this church and it has nothing to do with this case? I don't know what happened, if there's some sort of goofball kind of numerology going over one church in Pewaukee, but I've got another story about that church, and it is fascinating. It's this whole area, completely unrelated. This whole area of, let's just make it Paul. Paul owns a fancy old building that everybody thinks is beautiful. Did Paul tear down his own building? Or is Paul essentially like the protesters tearing down these statues because News Talk 1130 WISN. Mark Belling, late afternoon show, just a few moments away from me giving you the text in word Sizzling Summer Cash Contest. The weather forecast for the next few days. Cooler weather. In fact, we're going to drop way into the 50s tonight, down to 55. Those showers should be ending. Then for the rest of the week, partly sunny, and it'll get a little bit warmer every day. It stays in the 60s tomorrow, 68. Wednesday, 73 for a high. Thursday, 75. Friday, 76 degrees. Again, this is total coincidence. The stories are coming down the same time. They have nothing to do with one another. I mentioned this church, Queen of Apostles in Pewaukee. As probably many of you are aware, a lot of Catholic churches around the United States have consolidated for a lot of reasons, shortage of priests, etc. people move out to other areas, and the church that's left in the one area doesn't have many parishioners, so they need to put a church in a different place, can't maintain the two of them, and so on. Interestingly, in the city of Milwaukee, I mean, you could drive and go past 7 Catholic churches and go no more than a mile. Most of them are still operating. They've managed to try to keep a mass or something in one mass per each of them. Well, out in the Pewaukee area, there is a church. I think in order for me to tell this story, I have to explain the unique geography of Pewaukee. Like many of our communities in southeastern Wisconsin, there's 2 Pewaukees. There's the village and the city. The village is actually the urbanized area where the shops and the stores and, where the downtown is. The village of Pewaukee is kind of on the eastern edge of Pewaukee Lake. And that's where they have the downtown, the famous beach that I mentioned, and so on. The city of Pewaukee, it's called a city, but it's like a town. The city of Pewaukee is this huge, giant, rectangular area that goes north of Pewaukee Lake, south of Pewaukee Lake, and quite a ways east of Pewaukee Lake. The village is a little thimble in the middle of the city, but the village is a packed-in, dense little community with many older houses and so on, whereas the city basically was woods and has been gradually over the years turned into one subdivision after another, after another, after another. There's been significant population growth in the city as all these subdivisions have occurred. The church is in the village. There's an old church in the building called St. Mary's Church. The 2 parishes merged some time ago. Queen of Apostles, which is located out in kind of like the subdivision area, well, several miles east of the lake, and the village church, St. Mary's Church, is right in the village of Pewaukee, very close to Pewaukee Lake. St. Mary's Church is 150 years old. The Queen of Apostles Church is relatively new. The same parish, though, owns the both of them. Well, you all know where this story's going. The expenses of maintaining an old building like this, and they don't use that church anymore. They've moved all of their masses and other services and so on to the Queen of Apostles, the newer church in town. They want to tear down the old church, and the land's kind of valuable. They'd like to sell the land. Most of these parishes need money, so Queen of Apostles, which owns the church, wants to tear it down and sell it. The people who live in the village of Pewaukee, this church is their heritage. First of all, it's 150 years old, and it's kind of cool looking. I've been out to Pewaukee a few times lately. It's just sitting right there. You drive through the village of Pewaukee, and like every yard has a sign, Save St. Mary's Church. Well, here's the thing. It's real easy for somebody to say, save something else that somebody else has to pay for. I'd like to go past and put a sign, say, fine, you want to save it? Buy it. You buy it, then you do with it what you want. And that's where the issue has come to loggerheads. It has roiled the Pewaukee community. The church needs the money. The church is saying, look, there are people asking us to keep open this white elephant of a building, and it's an old white elephant that we don't use for much of anything. We need to get rid of the thing. And others are demanding that they not do it, but nobody's ponying up the money to make the church whole by buying the property from them. And remember, this thing is very close to the lake, and everything in Pewaukee's hotter than can be, so forth, so forth, so forth, and so forth. So the question becomes, should a community be able to stop the owner of a building from selling and tearing down a building they own? This has been debated in many other cases around the United States. Now, I'm a believer in the rights of private property. On the other hand, if the Eiffel Tower was owned by some private developer, I wouldn't knock it down either. But the thing is, that's the thing. Most of our historic landmarks are in the public domain. They're owned as part of public property. When it's privately held like this, it's very hard for me to justify a government coming in and trying to stop the owner of a property from doing something that they want with the building that they own. And as for the other community-minded people, if they can't raise enough money on contributions to pay fair market value, well, all you're doing is telling somebody else what they got to do with their stuff. How'd you like it if somebody did that with you? So what do you think? Should they make them save the church, or you're not for making them? Well, other than making them, what are you going to do, guilt them? This church has had a lot on its plate. Pastor falsely accused. Everybody's ripping him for trying to tear down the thing. As I say, the story came to a head and there is a development that just occurred, which is why I bring it up now, and it's completely independent of the other story. Well, they don't want to do the Mass a week because that means they got to keep the upkeep of the building, which in the building is hemorrhaging money. It's an old building. It probably needs 97 million repairs, probably not ADA compliant. You know how it needs to heat those buildings. And then if you know anything about the village, it's a mess. And they've moved out. They've not been in it for a long time. Paul said some rich fat cat. Well, now that's a separate thing, but nobody has stepped forward to do it. No rich fat cat has stepped in to buy the thing and say, here's a museum. Well, there is a resolution to this, kind of. The village of Pewaukee, and remember the church, the old church is in the village, the new one's out in the city. The village of Pewaukee has reached a deal. This thing is in court. They've been fighting in court, where the village has until February 1st to come up with the money to buy the church. If they don't, Queen of Apostles can tear it down. So the village of Pewaukee has an agreement to buy the church. They have, just think of it as a real estate deal. You have until February 1st to close. But if they can't close, if they can't come up with the money, if they can't figure out how much taxes they're going to raise to pay for this thing, or they can't find a private foundation to donate money and so on, then Queen of Apostles still has the ability to tear it down. So essentially this does is it buys 6 months of life for the church and puts the onus on the village of Pewaukee to figure out how to save this. Paul said, can they sell some of the land? Have you been in the village of Pewaukee? Not the city. Remember, the city's a sprawled out, 98 million acre. Village of Pewaukee is like, well, it's like West Allis, only it's on a lake. I mean, these buildings are right next to one another. There is no land. There is no land. I mean, you should see this thing. I mean, there's a walk up and a little bit of parking and so on, but I mean, I don't know what you'd be able to do with. The only thing I could imagine you could do with it is try to do some retro where you put in the idea was you could tear it down and convert it to housing because anything near the lake in Pewaukee is hot stuff, but I don't know what you can do with it. I mean, well, yeah, that's the thing. If something is historic and somebody wants it, somebody has to come up with the money, and it's hard for me to say that the people who've owned it forever have to keep taking the loss on something they don't need anymore. You're right. Our own city hall in Milwaukee is the same thing. At what point do we just say, let it sink all the way into the ground? Screw it. On the other hand, I'd make a crack about that, but I best not. News Talk 1130 WISN, Mark Belling, late afternoon show. I received the following from Pia Lombardi, who was a very close friend of Bernell Trammell, the African-American who was murdered in front of his storefront home in the River West area a little over a week ago in Milwaukee. Trammell was the guy who would stand around town holding his Donald Trump sign up in the air. His storefront had signs for every kind of cause imaginable. He was a very public supporter of President Trump and had an interesting, eclectic, and unusual life, and his murder has not yet been solved. There are many of his friends who are concerned that he may have been killed because of his public support for President Trump. We don't know that, however. If you've been following any of the stories about this, one of the people who worked with him and was a very close friend is a woman named Pia Lombardi, and she has contacted me with the following. I am on a mission to get his story out correctly and can answer anything that you may have. I helped him start that publishing company with 2 other people. I worked there for a year in 1994, then I continued a friendship with Bernell. I have no idea who his family is, as they have been estranged. I do not know what will happen of his archives that are 26 years of archived expressions he collected. He owned the Expressions Journal publication and media. He believed that everyone should know the power of the individual voice, their individual voice. He wanted people to submit poems, short stories, artwork, and anything that made them feel as though it expressed something that they felt. Think about it in a weird way. He was sort of Facebook before there was Facebook. He published all expressions free. He then had us go out and sell them on Brady and Farwell, mostly. We met so many people. We brought so many people together. We made people feel heard. As the years went by, though, less people would submit. So he would hold signs that would invoke conversations. He was never unkind to anyone. He was not crazy. He was a brilliant man. He knew the Bible front ways and back ways. He was a man of Jah. He was a Rastafarian, and so were all of us who lived and worked there in 1994 when his publishing company began. I do think that this was a strange occurrence. He should not have been killed. Let me tell you, though, as one of his closest friends, that Black Lives Matter has been suspect. So, people have said that was a supporter of Black Lives Matter. I've had other people who contacted me who know Trammell and say that he was not. I don't know what his causes were. As I said, Burnell had 90 million signs on his thing, and it was hard to figure out what the political ideology was. As long as this case still remains unsolved, and it is not solved yet, there are going to be people concerned that he was targeted for his very public political beliefs, which in his neighborhood put him in a significant minority. On the other hand, as I say, there's any number of reasons why people get killed. He lived in a very high crime area. His politics may have had nothing to do with this. We just don't know. If, however, this was a politically motivated killing, it puts in real perspective what we are facing right now. You wonder why some people don't want to put Trump bumper stickers on their cars. And again, maybe this wasn't politically motivated. We just don't know. This story, however, can't, despite the media's general lack of interest in it, be forgotten. Going to give you the 6 o'clock hour word. Sizzling Summer Cash Contest. You have until 7 p.m. to text this in and get your chance at $1,000. The word for this hour is family. Family, F-A-M-I-L-Y, family. Text family to 200-200 anytime between now and 7 o'clock. You'll get a text confirming entry plus iHeartRadio info. Standard date and message rates apply in this nationwide contest. We didn't have an opportunity in any depth today to get into the school closing issue. State Senator Steve Nass put out a press release today saying he believes that Tony Evers is going to issue an order closing all schools in the state. I indicated last week when the mask order came out, the most important part of it is the fact that the governor now thinks he can issue orders again. And he says he has the authority to do it. The mask order is somewhat controversial, but it is nothing in comparison to if Tony Evers goes and says that if you operate a small school of 11 kids on the UP border, you can't open because we're not going to open any of them. One of the things that the left has been saying about coronavirus in the beginning is you got to follow the science. You got to follow the science. Well, we know what the science is with coronavirus in children. You are statistically way more likely as a child to die of the flu than COVID. In fact, children are likelier to die in a car crash on the way to school than from coronavirus. What this is all about is unionized public school teachers who think that they could be at risk. If we are now, after the years of rolling over and caving into teachers, going to say that we're not going to open the schools because they are afraid that they are going to get sick, it means Tony Evers is totally controlled by that union. We have done nothing for 3 months but listen to crap hurled at police officers. They've gone out and risked getting coronavirus every single day since this thing started. Cops don't get to not work because of COVID. Firefighters don't get to not work because of COVID. Grocery store employees don't get to not work because of COVID. The people who work in the hospitals don't get to not work because of COVID. There are all sorts of people who have decided that their jobs were important enough and the services that were provided that they simply have to bite the bullet and go to work and face the risk of catching a contagious disease. These teachers who've been telling us forever about how essential they are have now decided that they can't do that. None of this has anything to do with the children. It has to do with teachers not wanting to work. So I'll make a deal with them. We open the schools, and those of you who don't want to come to work, quit. We'll find somebody else to do the teaching. Huh? Willing to take that deal? But stop asking us to give you your pay and your benefits when you will not step up to the plate and start teaching these kids. And as for the science, you look across all of Europe right now, almost every country, maybe all for that matter, is reopening their schools. Some reopened back in the spring because they recognize, A, kids don't get this, and B, well, when they do get it, they don't get sick, and B, education can't be postponed indefinitely. We are losing months and now potentially a year of the lives of these children and not giving them an opportunity to learn, not to mention the fact that our society is not set up for kids staying at home en masse for an entire year. School districts all over the state did these surveys, and the numbers came in and they were striking. Overwhelmingly, parents want to send their kids back to school. Less overwhelmingly, but clear, the teachers don't want to teach. Private school teachers who are not unionized, interestingly, almost all of them want to go back. They don't have these hang-ups. But public school teachers essentially don't want to do it, especially in Milwaukee and Madison. The question is, are we operating the schools for the students and the taxpayers or for the teachers? This is the same mistake that the professional sports leagues are making and indulging athletes who want to turn sporting events into political causes. This is angering some of their fans. Are we running these leagues for the players or for your customers, the fans? Now, whether or not you alienate a basketball fan or a baseball fan in the long run is rather irrelevant. But when your decision is to not teach kids and to leave them educationally orphaned, it is of higher consequence. If Tony Evers wants to assert for once some actual independence as governor, he'll sit back and do nothing and allow the local school boards to decide on their own what they're going to do. I predict he will gravitate toward doing what the union wants him to do in the same way that he has gravitated toward doing what the state employees want to do throughout this entire coronavirus thing. When you have a governor in over his head who was elected by a very thin margin and had the support of virtually every public government employee and school employee in the state, he knows who buttered his bread. And unfortunately, it's not people like me who are telling him to open up the schools. It's 6:20. News Talk 1130 WISN, Mark Belling. Late afternoon show. We were talking a little bit earlier about the election. I was hoping today, and maybe we'll do it tomorrow, to get into a discussion of this disaster that's going to occur with mail-in voting this fall. There is a relationship to this primary election, the final of which is on Tuesday of next week. If you're planning to vote by mail, mail it at the latest tomorrow. I don't know how people are aware, there's a significant problem right now with very, very slow mail delivery. There's been changes in policies at the post office where if they can't get something processed within a certain time, they simply leave it behind to be done the next day, and all sorts of mail is slowing down. If the ballot is not received by Tuesday, you're not counted. I again continue to urge people to vote by mail only if they simply refuse to go in person. You can go in person all week and vote, depending on the hours of your clerk's office, or you can go in person on Tuesday of next week. Same thing on election day. If you you just won't do it. I guess mail-in is a correct option, but I do not trust the mail right now. And so much of it, just look at some of the mail that you get and when some of it is being sent. The mail is just slow at the moment. And when you consider that some people are trusting this process to send in a ballot. If you send in your ballot on Monday, it's not going to get there by Tuesday, and I wouldn't be safe on Saturday or Friday either. Finally, you've been hearing reports that Wisconsin reached a months-long low in number of positive new cases of COVID, only 400 or so today. I caution you not to immediately jump cartwheels. Okay, we finally are out from underneath this. Again, these numbers are coming in sporadically. This isn't necessarily 1 days of test results. Some of these things, it's like the mail. They get backlogged in some counties and communities are putting test sites 2 or 3 or 4 days into one so you can get spikes for these reasons whatsoever. If the trend holds for an entire week, it's a sign that even with all the testing that's going on, we're getting fewer positives that are coming in. It may also be that so many people who are going in to be tested were tested in the last 2 to 3 to 4 weeks that some of the actual tests that are occurring are going down as well. And finally, this, from the unintended consequences of the lockdown. Do you know which company is reporting an increase in its sales in the United States for the first time in years? America's largest cigarette manufacturer, Altria, the parent of the Philip Morris brands and so on, are saying that they saw an increase from 2.5 to 3% of the population smoking during the lockdown. With people having nothing to do, they're now sitting home and smoking cigarettes. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. That's how we'll stay safe. Lock the guy in the house so he doesn't catch the COVID, and instead, he's going to start to smoke. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye.